subcommittee will come to order. I want to begin with welcoming our new ranking member, the gentleman from Indiana, Dan Burton, whom I've had the pleasure of working with before. Especially welcome his dedication and enthusiasm and the verve that he brings to all of his work. Thanks, sir. Pleasure working with you again. On our side, I'd like to acknowledge one of our new members who's with us today, Gerald E. Connolly from Virginia, and welcome him to the subcommittee. I'd like to start with a quote as follows. Today, the subcommittee had hoped to examine those realistic and productive measures that the parties directly and indirectly involved with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict might have taken to restore a sense of hope and maybe even make some material progress towards peace. But in the light of, I'll insert here the words "what's occurred," I'm not sure what's left to discuss. The quote continues. Over the past 6 years, there have been many plans and many envoys, and contrary to popular opinion, there has not been a deficit of attention, merely a deficit in performance. Commitments made to the United States or between the parties have often been honored only in the breach. The timing was never right. What was promised was never delivered. There was always a provocation, an incident, an upcoming election, a crisis, an attack. And so it is again today. That was a quote. If we strike the words that I inserted, "what occurred," and insert the words "Gaza conflict," and these sentences, which I read at this subcommittee's first hearing in 2007, are, to my dismay, equally applicable today. It only looks like we're going in circles. In fact, we are spiraling downward. I don't know where the bottom is, but I know it's there, and I know we're getting closer every day. It will hit with shattering force when through malice and terror, through shallow calculation and venal self-interest, through short-sightedness and through political cowardice, the two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is finally rendered impossible. The downward pressure comes from terrorism and the march of settlements. It comes from the firing of rockets and the perpetration of settler pogroms. It comes in daily images of destruction and the constant reiteration that they only understand the language of force. It comes in the form of a political party that is always just a few months away from reform, and in the form of government coalitions whose chief purpose it is to avoid new elections. It comes in the form of promises that bloodshed is what God desires and declarations that dirt and stones mean more than human life. It comes from tunnels in Gaza and, yes, from diggings in Jerusalem as well. Let me not be misunderstood. There is no moral equivalence between these acts, but they're all part of the same destructive dynamic. Since the end of the Clinton administration, the basic outlines of a peace agreement have been clear. And in fact, in its waning days, the government of Ehud Olmert, like other departing Israeli governments, further closed the gaps and added even more detail. Except now, there are three sides. And one of those sides is looking for a very different outcome than the other two. Hamas is the odd man out. I don't know what to do about that. I don't know how you make peace with half of a wannabe country. I don't know how you sign an agreement with an entity whose legal, political, and administrative bona fides are all in question. Which brings us to Gaza, where so many of the contradictions in this conflict come into focus. Start with Hamas, a terrorist organization, an entity beyond the pale. They are the enemy, and no one can talk to them until they accept the quartet's conditions of recognizing Israel, repudiating violence, and accepting the PLO's agreements with Israel. Except that for years, Israel has been talking to Hamas through Egypt and directly to Hamas through prisoners in Israeli jails. And when the IDF was in Gaza in force, with reserves building up outside, the Israelis announced that the destruction of Hamas was absolutely not their goal. Hamas is a deadly, vicious, implacable enemy, but somehow one that they left in place. For their part, the Fatah-led PA blasted Israel for violence while quietly hoping that the IDF would cripple Hamas and pave the way for the Palestinian Authority's return to Gaza. Likewise, the PA has continuously denounced Hamas for the 2007 coup in Gaza and then intermittently engaged in direct talks to form a unity government with it. And Hamas itself, the great paragon of ideological purity, insists in Arabic that its goal is the complete liberation of Palestine, which is to say the elimination of the State of Israel, while in English it declares that Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 borders would be sufficient for long-term, but not permanent, peace. One real bright spot in all the chaos is the work of the U.S. Security Coordinator, Lieutenant General Keith Dayton, who without fanfare and very little money has helped stand up a force of several hundred competent and disciplined Palestinian security forces. Trained in Jordan and deployed successfully to major cities in the West Bank, these mostly young Palestinians have restored law and order in Jenin and Nablus and are finally starting to put some authority back into the Palestinian Authority, which for years has been leaking the stuff like a bucket with no bottom. I think we've learned from our own awful experience in Iraq that between politics and security, security has to come first. So what can be made of the new and growing security dynamic in the West Bank remains to be seen. A lot will depend on whether Israel, in a break from years of habit, can recognize its own self-interest in the success of this Palestinian enterprise. And even if that happens, and I think we really must try hard to help that process along, how developments in the West Bank can be used to reestablish a connection with Gaza is far from clear. And it is in Gaza that the United States, Israel, the PA, and Arab states have to start coming up with answers. There are pressing humanitarian needs and a reconstruction vacuum that will surely be filled by someone, either for good or ill. Hamas is still in charge there, and depending on what polls you read and which people you talk to, is either badly damaged or fully in command. The war has either alienated them from the public or powerfully reinforced their leadership. Hamas has either suffered a severe blow or has benefited immensely from merely surviving the Israeli onslaught. The fact that so basic a question can still be in doubt should make all of us a little more circumspect in our assertions and a little less confident in our understanding of this conflict. Fortunately, we have with us today a panel with real expertise in the politics of Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Egypt, to help us understand where the interests of the parties lie and what the equities they most need to protect in coming to grips with the future of Gaza. It is our job to start answering these same questions for ourselves. What is it that we want? How can we achieve it? What has worked and what has to be done differently? What assumptions have we made that haven't been borne out in fact? We can start today by learning from our distinguished witnesses. Turn now to my friend, partner, Dan Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to be your partner. We've had our differences over the years on the floor and in the committee, but one thing in which we've always agreed has been the Middle Eastern problems, and in particular, the survivability of our good friend Israel. I have a statement I'd like to submit for the record, but I'd like to make a few comments, if I may. When Ariel Sharon decided to give Gaza away, and they started destroying the settlements that were in Gaza, I, for one, was very concerned about that because I thought there were no guarantees of Israel's right to exist from the parties involved, and I was concerned that Hezbollah would take advantage of, or Hamas would take advantage of the situation in Gaza as soon as things took place. And as I watched those people being removed from their homes and their homes being bulldozed, it was a very disheartening situation. But I had great confidence in Ariel Sharon, and I felt like his decisions were very well thought out, and that this was probably a step toward a lasting peace. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The minute Gaza became independent, Hezbollah or Hamas started moving very rapidly by getting weapons in from Iran through Syria, all kinds of rockets and other equipment, and started their attacks on Israel. My concern today, and what I'd like to get from the panelists, Mr. Chairman, is what they believe the long-term view is from their perspective on the situation in Gaza, what the long-term view is from their perspective on Iran. Will Iran start reducing or working with the rest of the world in trying to stop the weapons from getting into Gaza and into Lebanon and Hezbollah up there? And can we expect any real movement toward a lasting peace? We've been talking about this as long as I've been in Congress. I think you and I have been in Congress 26 years, and we come back to the same position year after year after year, where there's a determination by Iran, by Syria, by Hamas and Hezbollah to destroy Israel and deny their right to exist. So I'd like to ask the panelists today if they see any light at the end of the tunnel, if they think the ending of the hostilities that have taken place will lead to a lasting peace in Gaza, and what their prognostication is about as far as Iran is concerned. The administration has indicated they want to try to open up a dialogue with Iran to try to find out if there's a pathway to peace. But unless there's a guarantee of Israel's right to exist, I don't think there's going to be any solution to the problems over there. And so if there were administration people here today, Mr. Chairman, I'd say I hope they'd be very careful when they discuss these issues with the Iranians to make sure that the number one question at every meeting is, will you finally agree to Israel's right to exist and try to work out a peaceful solution to these problems over there? So there's an awful lot of things that are going on that we'd like to talk about today. I know I've covered quite a bit of the waterfront with my opening remarks, but these are all interrelated, and so I'd like to hear what your perspective is on all of these issues. And in particular, in closing, I'd like to thank Danny Pletka for being here. We worked together when she worked for Jesse Helms on a number of issues. She's a very bright lady, and we're really happy to have you here today. You're now with the American Enterprise Institute, a very fine group, and I'll look forward to working with you in the future. And Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and your colleagues on your side of the aisle and finding hopefully a solution to some of these problems in the Middle East. I yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Without objection, your full statement will be put in the record, as it will for all other members. I sent out a notice to each of the members yesterday. I hope everybody saw it, that we would allow opening statements, but we want to keep them for an opening comment, maybe for 1 minute apiece, and we will do that as we usually do on this subcommittee in order of the members' appearance at the committee. Mr. Wexler, if you would like.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to commend you for assembling an extraordinary group today. Mr. McCoskey is someone I have relied upon and continue to rely upon, and I don't think there's a more knowledgeable voice in this country in terms of the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Dr. Asali as well, I think, is uniquely a powerful and constructive both advocate and resource for the United States Congress, and many of us rely upon him greatly. And despite Mr. Burton's wonderful comments, Ms. Pleck, we too welcome you, and Dr. Dunn as well.
Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As one of our witnesses points out here today, many believe that there is a magical solution to the Israel-Palestine problem. If only we can arrange the diplomatic talks a certain way, there's this feeling that it will be solved. And we have a new special envoy, Senator Mitchell, who's going to spend considerable energy working this region. He'll be working and reaching for peace. But the idea that some type of grand bargain might be celebrated in the Rose Garden is very far off. Senator Mitchell must contend with the fact that there are those in the region, Hamas and others, who do not even recognize Israel's existence. Israel must be replaced with an Islamic state, according to Hamas. So this is a region of the world plagued with a growing extremism that will frustrate peace initiatives and won't be easily or quickly reversed. This hearing asks what can be built on the wreckage. I'm yet to see the firm foundation upon which structures must be built, but that does not mean we don't try. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this hearing.
The chair would like to recognize the presence of the chair of the full committee, Howard Berman, and ask the chairman if he would like to use his prerogative to. The chairman has waived. We go next to Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing today. I think that it's imperative we understand the lessons learned from the recent Gaza conflict. Only with a more durable ceasefire and a commitment from Hamas to forswear violence can we address the long-term humanitarian needs of the people of the Gaza Strip. I, for one, look to this week's Israeli election as actually an encouraging sign in the effort for renewing the peace process. While the closeness of the vote may present some challenges, the edge appears to lie with those who vigorously want to pursue the peace process. When taken together, the election results, the current ceasefire, no matter how tenuous, and the commitment of President Obama to invest U.S. capital by engaging personally in the peace process, as well as his appointment of Special Envoy George Mitchell, are encouraging signs that we can broker a long-term solution in the interest of all parties. I welcome today's witnesses and look forward to hearing from them about their recommendations for moving forward in a positive direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence here. I've got an abundance of paper in front of me. Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'd like to thank you for hosting the subcommittee hearing today. It's a privilege and an honor to be here and to be a member of this very important subcommittee. As we all know, this is a very critical time to be hearing about the critical topic of Gaza. I'm glad that we're here to help move forward on the necessary rehabilitation and reconstruction efforts in Gaza. I take this opportunity to welcome all speakers and witnesses to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and I look forward to hearing your testimony as well as the discussion and exchange of views on conflicts in Gaza, the reconstruction, and Middle East peace. And also, Mr. Chairman, I would ask unanimous consent. I was approached by an organization called the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee who'd like to submit a statement, was not able to do so, and so I ask unanimous consent that their statement be allowed to be put into the record.
Without objection. Thank you very much, and Mr. Ellison, we welcome you to the committee as well. Ms. Berkeley, welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be back, and I also want to thank you for holding this hearing. I was part of a congressional delegation that was among the last civilians to leave the Gaza when the Israelis left. As a Jew, it was very difficult for me to watch other Jews being forcibly removed from their homes, many of whom had lived in the Gaza for 3 generations. But it was done by the Israelis in the interest of peace and with the hope that the Palestinians would be able to demonstrate to the world that they were capable of self-governance. We were hopeful, I was certainly hopeful, that schools would be built, infrastructure would be created, and that the Palestinians would take control of their own lives. Unfortunately, the result has been quite different. Hamas has taken over, a terrorist organization that continues not only to terrorize Israel by raining rockets on innocent Israeli civilians from the Gaza, but raining terror on their own people. It would be my hope, especially in the aftermath of the last action by the Israelis, precipitated by the continuous launching of rockets into Israel, that the Palestinian people would see that Hamas is not their future, and making a just and lasting peace with Israel and recognizing Israel's right to exist and securing the borders would be in the best interest of both people. And that would be my hope. But I have become, I must say, Mr. Chairman, very cynical over the last few years, and hopeful that we will see a new day, but I am very doubtful that that will happen, and I'm anxious to hear our witnesses talk about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Burton, for calling this meeting today, and thank you to the guests who will present to us. The Gaza Strip has obviously been a problem for many, many years, both when Egypt was much more involved, when Israel has been involved, and obviously in its own sense right now. And of course, the movement of weapons and missiles and rockets into the Gaza Strip from a number of means of getting through there has been a problem which has continued to present more difficulties. Now that the general fighting has stopped at the level it was a couple of weeks ago, obviously there's still rockets being fired, and this is a very fragile situation. I think we acknowledge that Egypt, who has been helpful, is in a position where they can continue to help limit the amount of weapons that come in through that area. Egypt does not want an unstable or destabilized Hamas or region to flow into its areas as well. And if the presenters today can comment on the role that Egypt continues to play, and of course we encourage their continued cooperation as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Burton. It's great to be back in this new session on this committee. Look forward to working with you and the timely and substantive work of this committee, and really getting it right in Gaza is central to really making progress in the Middle East. And so thank the panel for being here and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. We also want to welcome Mr. McMahon, new member to the Congress, new member to the committee and the subcommittee. Would you like a minute if you want to take that now? You are recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Ackerman, and I thank the subcommittee for allowing me to speak today. My first hearing here, first time in. I'd like to thank our witnesses for sharing their knowledge with us here today, and I hope to share their conclusions with my constituents back home. Clearly, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is very grave, yet Hamas still continues to exacerbate the humanitarian situation by using innocent civilians to leverage power over this broken region to advance their political agenda. I think that most of my colleagues in this room would agree that as the premier nation allocating assistance to Gaza, the U.S. is currently in quite a predicament. If Hamas increases its influence through circumventing the assistance and manipulating civilians, what is to be expected for the future of our sister nation, Israel, and for the region as a whole? Mr. Chairman, my constituents, both Arab and Jewish alike, are concerned for their families in the region and cannot bear for their relatives to be treated as worthless pawns. Despite the severity of the situation, I remain hopeful that a secure peace agreement that embraces the two-state solution can be reached through the leadership of President Barack Obama and Senator Mitchell, and I hope through efforts here today we can bring humanitarian relief to all those who suffer in the region. I hope that we reaffirm our commitment that the only future for Israel and Palestine is a path to peace, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to our witnesses. We're joined today by a truly first-rate group, each of whom brings years of hands-on expertise and analytical experience to this hearing. David Makovsky is a senior fellow and director of the Washington Institute's Project on the Middle East Peace Process. He's also an adjunct lecturer in Middle Eastern Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Paul Mitchell School of Advanced International Studies. Before joining the Washington Institute, Mr. Makovsky covered the peace process from 1989 to 2000 as executive editor of the Jerusalem Post and as diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz. Now a contributing editor to the U.S. News and World Report, he served for 11 years as the magazine's special Jerusalem correspondent. Dr. Ziad Asali is president and founder of the American Task Force on Palestine, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in 2003 and based in Washington, D.C. Dr. Asali was born in Jerusalem and received his M.D. from the American University of Beirut, Medical School in 1967. He completed his residency in Salt Lake City, Utah, and then practiced medicine in Jerusalem before returning to the U.S. in 1973. Dr. Asali is also founder and chairman of the American Charities for Palestine. Michelle Dunn is a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She also edits the Arab Reform Bulletin, a monthly online journal exploring political, economic, and human rights developments in Arab countries. A specialist in the Middle East at the U.S. Department of State from 1986 to 2003, Dr. Dunn holds a Ph.D. in Arabic language from Georgetown University. Danielle Pletka is Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, she served for 10 years as a senior professional staff member for the Near East and South Asia on the U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. In addition to her work at AEI, she was also a member of the congressionally mandated U.S. Institute of Peace Task Force on the United Nations. We will begin with Dr. Makovsky.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to be with you today. Until post-conflict arrangements are settled, it's premature to reach a definitive conclusion on the recent war in Gaza. However, it is possible to make a preliminary assessment. Israel set forward one major objective for itself at the start of this war, specifically to avert Hamas rocket fire aimed at its southern cities. The objective of this war was not the toppling of Hamas. Israel has also sought to restore the deterrence that it felt that it lost in the inconclusive 2006 war against Hezbollah in Lebanon. As a result, in contrast to the 2006 war, Israel's objectives were defined more carefully. One of Israel's main tactics for ensuring that its cities are not the target of Hamas rockets is to target the myriad of smuggling tunnels along the Egypt-Gaza border that Hamas uses to rearm itself. As such, Israel's success in shutting down or destroying these tunnels will also be part of the post-war evaluation. First, some background to this Gaza conflict. As was noted here, Israel removed all of its settlers and left Gaza in 2005, yet Hamas rocket fire has been relentless, especially after Hamas ascended to power in 2006. By mid-2008, Israel and Hamas have been observing a ceasefire for 6 months, which expired on December 19th. Israel made clear that it wanted to extend the ceasefire, yet Hamas fired 200 rockets at Israeli cities. There are those who argue that Hamas wanted to use rocket fire as a means of changing the terms of the ceasefire. However, Israel felt it had no choice but military action. Hamas believed that by taking up positions in densely populated parts of the Gaza Strip in order to fire indiscriminately at Israeli cities, it would be immune to retaliation. This was not the case. Israel embarked on what it called Operation Cast Lead, a campaign that went on for less than a month, first by air and then by ground, primarily in northern Gaza. While Hamas has sought to claim victory in the aftermath of the fighting, these claims are largely hollow. Its leadership was in hiding throughout the fighting. Hamas did not offer serious opposition on the ground, a fact that will make it difficult for the organization to credibly claim that it defended Gaza, let alone score a victory. In contrast, Hezbollah in 2006 offered substantial resistance and determined opposition to Israeli ground forces, employing the full range of its capabilities. According to the Palestinian-run Jerusalem Media and Communication Center polling unit, only 35% of Palestinians in Gaza believe Hamas's assertion of victory. Israel succeeded in degrading Hamas's ability to fire rockets at Israeli cities. Military analysts widely believe that the Israeli army was much better prepared for this conflict on nearly every level, planning, training, equipment, and force readiness, than it was in 2006. Israel sustained far fewer casualties and injuries than it did in 2006. Arab casualties were lower in Gaza than Lebanon, but as I will point to later in my remarks, they were still considerable. Although many thought Israel's deterrence was eroded in the 2006 war, the Israeli officials state that it was restored after the current fighting in Gaza with Hamas. Hamas is responsible for the Gaza population in a manner that is not true for Hezbollah in Lebanon. Therefore, there is hope that this deterrence will be sustained over time. It is noteworthy that Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran were either unwilling or unable to assist Hamas during the conflict, excluding rhetorical support. This should give Hamas pause about the value of its alliances. Hezbollah did not open up a second front, contrary to speculation that it might, and this might be a sign that Israel did increase its deterrence during the 2006 war, which would be significant. While Iran interpreted the inconclusive outcome in 2006 as a victory for its proxy Hezbollah and for Tehran's own regional influence, Iran will have to view the Gaza conflict as a setback. It cannot believe that it gained any momentum with this episode. Moreover, divisions surfaced within the Arab world. Egypt and Saudi Arabia boycotted an aborted Arab summit that they viewed as supportive of Hamas and implicitly Iran. The Egyptian leadership was willing to withstand demonstrations and criticism and still refused to support Hamas's demand that it gain control of a key access point to Gaza. All these developments were negative from Hamas's perspective. The Gaza war brought fresh international focus to the tunnel network between the Egyptian Sinai and Gaza. The issue of border security has become increasingly important for Israel, particularly since the network is crucial to Hamas's ability to rearm. During the recent conflict, Hamas fired 122-millimeter ground artillery rockets, a type of rocket that's designed by Iran to fit through the tunnels, by hitting Gadara, 20 miles south of Tel Aviv. It fired many rockets as well. 1 million Israelis are now within this rocket's range, including the largest city in southern Israel, Beersheba. If more sophisticated, longer-range rockets are smuggled into Gaza, Israel's international airport could come within range within the very near future. For Israel, this international focus on the tunnel network is necessary, albeit not sufficient. International focus is not synonymous with action. For example, in 2006, the UN Security Council Resolution 1701 addressed the issue of arms smuggling for Hezbollah by calling on an embargo on weapons to Hezbollah militias, Lebanese militias. This provision, however, has never been enforced. There are estimates that Hezbollah has in fact tripled the number of its rockets since 2006. Therefore, a more practical approach was being tried now. Toward the end of this war, the United States and Israel signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an MOU, that authorizes U.S. assistance to Egypt to halt the flow of arms. This international assistance could potentially involve the U.S. Navy and NATO elements to help police international waters, since the Grads are believed to come from transit points in Iran, Somalia, Eritrea, and Yemen.
I'm going to have to ask you to start to sum up.
Okay. The question will be, will Egypt indeed recognize that its national security is at stake? Because this is not a favor to Israel. It clearly has an interest in the Palestinian Authority being stronger and also weakening its own opposition at home, the Muslim Brotherhood. And it clearly does not want to see Iran gain, as President Mubarak made clear in a speech the other day. If Egypt acts, this will be the optimal situation. I fear if Egypt does not act, Israel will go back into southern Gaza, occupy the Philadelphia corridor as it is known, and on its own try to explode these tunnels. To avoid this scenario, Egypt is critical, but so is the MFO, the multinational forces in the Sinai. It was put in place as an early warning system against possible Egyptian attack against Israel, given the wars in the 60s and 70s. But given the new threats, maybe we should think of an enhanced role for the MFO given the problem of tunnels, like monitoring some of the main roads that traverse the Sinai. There are very few of them. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been helpful.
You're going to need to conclude.
Okay. I will just conclude here by saying the question here of Gaza reconstruction is something that we will discuss. I'm happy in the Q&A to discuss this as well. It's clear to me that the pivot point is the Palestinian Authority being in Gaza and making that difference. The Arab world could provide assistance, but they could also provide assistance by delegitimizing Hamas. Comments to say on the Israeli elections and what next steps will be taken by Mitchell, but I'll do that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Asali. Push your button on.
As requested by your staff, allow me to state for the record that the recently signed Memorandum of Understanding mentioned in my bio between American Charities for Palestine and USAID is only for the purposes of vetting recipients of donations made by ACP. Neither I nor ACP has received any federal grant. Now I would start my testimony.
We will restart your time.
Thank you very much. And I will not go beyond.
We'll allow you the same latitude.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I wish to thank you and the subcommittee's esteemed members for the privilege to testify before you and summarize my 51-page written testimony. Although Hamas launched reckless and provocative rocket attacks against Israel, Gazans are not Hamas. They are not combatants and should not be punished. As a human being and as a physician, I was horrified by the tragedy that has befallen the people of Gaza by Israel's disproportionate use of force. After an estimated 1,400 deaths and 5,400 injuries, 80% of surviving Gazas now depend on food aid, and 51,000 need shelter. Their suffering must come to an immediate stop. Gaza lies in ruins, but Hamas still controls Gaza.
I'm afraid we cannot have any approbation, approval, or disapproval from the audience. Everybody's welcome to be here. So we want to just constrain our approval or disapproval of any of the witnesses or even any of the members. You can criticize us someplace else, but not in this room. Thank you.
Thank you. Restart the clock for me.
We will not subtract my comment.
Gaza lies in ruins, but Hamas still controls Gaza, and the responsible policies of the PA and other U.S. Arab allies have been undermined. Mr. Chairman, the challenge now is providing essential aid and reconstruction to the people of Gaza without bolstering Hamas. Opening the crossings and implementing the access and movement agreements of 2005 is essential. Immediate humanitarian assistance should proceed unimpeded and without politicization to deliver food, shelter, medical, fuel, and educational supplies, as well as power and sanitation. It should be provided and expanded through existing agencies, including UNRWA and international NGOs. If Hamas again attempts to interfere, it risks suspension of aid. Reconstruction, however, takes time and requires a new international mechanism that can ensure entry of construction materials into Gaza, secure from political interference, and any party blocking the reconstruction process must publicly bear the blame. This mechanism should be structured to quickly grant contracts, vet recipients, and have security and logistical components. This must be coordinated by the new U.S. Special Envoy to the Middle East and composed of the Quartet, the PA, and the indispensable Egypt. Private reconstruction should be managed through direct bank transfers from the PA to beneficiaries, as proposed by Prime Minister Fayyad, which will benefit 21,000 property owners at a cost of $600 to $800 million. The Palestinian partner for reconstruction can only be the PA under President Abbas. A non-partisan Palestinian National Accord government could help, but it must meet the Quartet conditions, exert security control, and have the specific mandate of overseeing reconstruction and preparing for elections. Mr. Chairman, there is no military solution to this conflict. And until it is resolved through two states, a secure Israel, alongside a viable Palestine freed from occupation, further violence is inevitable. Unless progress is made on advancing Palestinian statehood and quality of life through negotiations, and unless the PA and Fatah implement serious and genuine reforms, the PA will continue to weaken. Without progress, anything rebuilt will be destroyed. Our own actions can either foster hope or feed hate. Permanent status negotiations must continue, but cannot be sustained without expanding the space of freedom in Palestinian cities and in delivering tangible improvements in access, mobility, and economic opportunities. Settlements entrench the occupation and are the most pressing political logistical impediment to peace. All hopes for progress depend on an immediate settlement freeze, and this is where U.S. leadership must be asserted to preserve the credibility of the two-state solution. U.S. assistance must be intensified to help the PA further develop the new professional security system, which has proven its effectiveness under very difficult circumstances. It also has to develop the fledgling economy unimpeded by unreasonable restrictions and pursue good governance reform, transparency, and the rule of law. A devastated Gaza, a stagnant West Bank, and a moribund peace process would benefit extremism. The losers then will be Palestinians, Israel, and the cause of peace, and most importantly, our own national interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Asali. Dr. Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the subcommittee for the privilege of testifying before you. I'm going to be discussing the role of Egypt in this crisis, and I'm sure the subcommittee members are aware of Egypt's mediation effort and the elements of a ceasefire proposal that Egypt has been putting forward. The basic elements are a mutually agreed ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, as opposed to the unilateral ceasefire that exists now. And the duration of that would probably be something on the order of 18 months renewable. The reopening of crossings to Gaza with some limitations as to what could enter Gaza. A prisoner exchange that would involve perhaps the release of Israeli hostage Gilad Shalit, and talks between Fatah and Hamas. And I'd like to note that there are indications in the press that those talks are already beginning in Cairo between Fatah and Hamas representatives. So what are the Egyptian interests that inform Egypt's actions here? I would say in the current crisis, Egypt has demonstrated that it has two principal interests related to Gaza. One of them is that Egypt wants to avoid taking on responsibility for the 1.5 million Palestinians living in Gaza. And second, Egypt is trying through its mediation efforts to restore some role for the Palestinian Authority under the leadership of President Mahmoud Abbas, to the extent that is possible. Now, regarding Egypt taking on responsibility for the Palestinians, there are at least two ways this could happen. And President Hosni Mubarak is going to try to avoid either one of them. One possibility is that if there were a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, tens or hundreds of thousands of Palestinians could flood across the border into the Sinai and stay on a semi-permanent basis. And as I'm sure the members of the subcommittee are aware, this is not an idle fear. It actually happened a year ago in January 2008, that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians crossed the border illegally, and it took Egypt about 2 weeks to get them to leave and to reestablish control over its international border. Then there is this question of whether Egypt would take on some sort of a role in Gaza itself, perhaps administering Gaza the way Egypt did between 1948 and 1967. Now, this is not the official policy of Israel or anyone else. No one is asking Egypt to do this, but the suggestion that this might be a possibility has caused a lot of concern in Egypt. Now, President Mubarak will resist this for a couple of reasons. First of all, he realizes that governing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, either in Sinai or in Gaza itself, would be a thankless task for Egypt. But he also has reason to be concerned about stability in his own country should one or other of these situations be forced on Egypt. Sinai is already a troubled area, populated largely by Bedouin with little loyalty to the Egyptian state, and terrorists have carried out several large-scale attacks there in recent years. The introduction of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees there, perhaps including militants from Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, would undoubtedly increase tension and the danger of terrorism there. Inside Egypt itself, although many Egyptians have called on their government to extend greater diplomatic and humanitarian support to Gaza, actual Egyptian rule in Gaza, or rule of many Palestinian refugees in Sinai, would very much inflame anti-government sentiment in Egypt. And as I'm sure the members of the subcommittee are aware, there is significant anti-government sentiment in Egypt today. Protests of one kind or another, mostly about domestic, economic, and human rights issues, have become a daily phenomenon in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood, that is the primary opposition movement in Egypt, supports Hamas fervently and has been organizing protests against the government. There has developed in Egypt a sort of tradition since the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Uprising in 2000 of protests that begin with in support of Palestinians and criticizing Israel and often the United States, and then those protests turn against Mubarak and call for an end to his rule. Now, the second goal that I mentioned for Egypt in this Gaza crisis is the desire to restore the Palestinian Authority to a role in Gaza to the extent that that is feasible. Egypt takes a realist approach to Hamas. It would prefer that Hamas not rule Gaza, but acknowledges that at this point it's impossible to ignore the group. So one constant in Egyptian mediation efforts has been to insist, for example, on enforcing the terms of the 2005 Rafah Agreement, which treats the Palestinian Authority as the responsible party on the Gaza side of the border. And Egypt would like to see the Palestinian Authority returned there, to at a minimum, to the border with Egypt. Egypt has also pressed Hamas to agree to resume reconciliation talks with Fatah, which were going on under Egyptian auspices for some time, were broken off in November 2008, and seem to be perhaps resuming now. Regarding the arms smuggling issue through Rafah, Egyptian officials are undoubtedly aware that there's a spotlight on the issue now. David Makovsky mentioned that there has been technical assistance from the United States through the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a $23 million program that was funded out of U.S. annual military assistance to Egypt. This has now been implemented in only the last week, and there's actual technical monitoring now by the Egyptians with this assistance from the United States of tunneling and other underground movements through the Rafah area. And Egypt should be able, with this tool, to significantly improve its performance in preventing arms trafficking into Gaza. There is a report, by the way, in the Jerusalem Post today that talks about that and says there is significantly stepped up Egyptian enforcement.
You're going to have to start to summarize.
Okay. The aftermath of the Gaza crisis does afford some opportunities for the U.S. and Egypt to strengthen their ties, which have been strained in recent years. U.S. and Egyptian goals regarding Gaza are largely consonant. Over the longer term, however, I'd like to note that it will be necessary for Egypt and the United States to reach an understanding on progress on human and civil rights inside Egypt as well, in order for the partnership to really flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Ms. Pletka.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Burton, for inviting me today. I'm going to summarize my remarks and ask that you put my full statement in the record. Mr. Bush was kind enough to quote my statement. I'm glad somebody read it in advance. I suggested that part of the problem historically has been that each time a new administration comes to the Israeli-Palestinian problem, they assume that there is some magical peace that has not been fulfilled, some individual who will make it all work right, some process that we have not embraced. And the truth is, of course, there simply is no magic to any of this, and we should stop thinking about the problem in those ways. I would also add that the measure that we have historically used to discuss progress between the Israelis and the Palestinians has almost entirely been self-referential. We always talk about what we've done and how we've made progress and how everybody is at the table, and we really haven't measured the Palestinians' progress. I would argue that perhaps we've paid more attention to the Israelis, but no attention to Palestinian progress on the ground. And when I say Palestinian progress on the ground, I do not mean the shape of their government, the stability of their government. I mean the progress of individual Palestinians, the general welfare of the Palestinian people. And in fact, the Palestinian people as a whole have made very little appreciable progress. To the contrary, there's been a great decline in standards of living and a great flight by Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza, not just Gaza, I would underscore, also from the West Bank. Nor has the cause of peace made any great strides forward in recent years, including when President Bush turned his attention to it, when President Clinton put a great deal of personal effort and attention towards it. There are some who are going to suggest now, in the aftermath of this Gaza war, that the fact that Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and others have turned on Hamas is a real sign of progress and hope for the future. And I think that we need to be very careful in making that judgment. I think that the main motivation there is that they see Hamas very clearly for what Hamas is, the face of jihadism, which represents a threat not just to Israel, not just to the Palestinians, but more specifically to them. And I think that's where a lot of that antipathy comes from. Whether we can manipulate that or gain from it is another thing, but let's understand it for what it is. What should American goals really be in the West Bank and Gaza, specifically between the Israelis and the Palestinians? At the end of the day, what our ambition is what our ambition always has been. It is to build peace on a stable edifice. That edifice may or may not include a Palestinian state. Personally, I think that it would be inevitable, but the fact that we have always been willing to suggest that somehow the fact that we want a Palestinian state is progress towards peace is really an illusion. It is not progress towards peace. It is the stability of the edifice itself that is in question. We cannot, I think, as we consider new ways of going forward, embrace a relationship with Hamas. That is a real danger. There are some who have suggested that the United States should open up talks with Hamas, much as we are thinking about opening up talks with the Iranian regime. That is not a good way forward. It is a dangerous way forward. It risks undermining not just the Israelis, of course, but the Palestinian Authority and all moderate Palestinians that have sought to diminish Hamas's role as it has come forward in Gaza. Also, in that regard, we need to be very, very careful of temptations to tinker in Palestinian politics. We have seen in recent reports talks about how we can reach out to particular members of Hamas and not talk to other members of Hamas, thereby strengthening the moderates and putting down the bad guys. We have historically been extraordinarily bad at tinkering in politics. We're not that good at tinkering at our own politics. We are really quite bad at tinkering in Arab politics, and that is a dangerous path forward for us. On the other side, Mr. Burton, you suggested that somehow these rocket attacks from Gaza and the war should be a reason to rethink the wisdom of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. And I would only say that this is the Israelis' business. You talked about Ariel Sharon and his decision, and I think that's true. There were too many in the United States who wanted to use U.S. influence to either push the Israelis to withdraw or to force the Israelis not to withdraw. This is an assessment that they must make, and in fact, they are now living with the consequences of that decision. It was not our decision to make. today, talking about Gaza, we have not talked enough about one of the huge sources of the problem, which is Iran. Hamas would not have rockets to lob anywhere if Iran did not continually resupply them. Yes, it's true they use the tunnels and sea routes and other routes as well, but at the end of the day, the source of the problem is one that needs to be addressed. By sitting down with the Iranians, as the Obama administration has indicated it wishes to in the coming months, I see very little likelihood that this is going to be on the top of the agenda. To the contrary, what are we going to talk about? They have said very clearly, we're going to talk about the nuclear weapons program. So that is a troubling fact, and something that I think Congress can play a strong role in pushing back to the top of the agenda. Just a quick note on the question of aid to the Palestinians, because you asked me to talk a little bit about this, and I think that we have to recognize that the heart of the problem, aid to the Palestinians, but particularly to Gaza, lies in UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, which has basically become a wholly owned subsidiary of Hamas, in my estimation. It is a propagandist for Hamas. They have 24,000+ employees. Compare that, by the way, to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which is responsible for refugees all around the world, which has less than a quarter of that number of employees. They are based in Gaza. They do not vet the NGOs with whom they work. They do not vet their employees. They have allowed Hamas in the past to manipulate aid. It does not go to the purposes that we desire, and I think that it's important that we revisit their role and United States assistance through them. One additional note on the role of international organizations that might be of interest to the Congress, which has spoken in this committee, which has spoken to this issue many times in the past. At the end of January, I will wrap up. At the end of January, the Palestinian Authority granted jurisdiction to the International Criminal Court for the West Bank and Gaza, and the ICC has now opened up an investigation into Israeli war crimes in Gaza. I do not see that as a very productive way for the international community to go forward. Last, and in wrapping up, I think that we need to recognize that while Hamas has been a major problem, no one can underestimate the problem that it represents. It should not force us to look at Fatah through rose-colored glasses. This has been our habit in the past. Oh, well, if Hamas is lousy, then clearly if Hamas is lousy, Fatah is better. It is a cop-out on the part of the United States that we have failed to focus on governance for the Palestinians, that we have failed to focus on accountability, that we have failed to use our aid to try and deliver to the Palestinian people the kind of things that we wish to deliver to ourselves, a responsible, accountable government that actually promises something that is more important to the day-to-day lives of Palestinians than a Palestinian state, and that is just a little bit of hope for their future and the future of their children. Thank you, Mr. Sherman.
Thank you, and thank all of our witnesses. The chair will re-announce that we're going to operate under the 5-minute rule, and the chair will be less flexible with the members of the committee than we were with the panel in order to keep things moving, and try to keep me to the 5-minute rule too, whoever is running these clocks. A peaceful solution, a two-state solution, if you will, seems difficult, if not impossible, with Hamas as an active player and controlling the West Bank. And it seems that a lot of energies have been spent with all the theories of how you get them basically unelected. Whether you hobble them, as the Israelis have attempted to do, or whether you show them that there is a better alternative in the West Bank, it would seem that a lot of hope is being placed on an election that might take place in which they become delegitimized as far as a part of the government or the government. I think that that's putting too many of our eggs in one basket. If Hamas is unelected, do they really go away? If they're a terrorist organization, do terrorist organizations not exist or function if they don't hold elective office? Because very few do. And we seem to be going in that direction in different places in the world. Or is there a different way to deal with this? Or how do we deal with it specifically in this case? And is the problem really, as was pointed out by our last witness, Iranian-generated? And does that have to be solved before the Israeli-Palestinian/Hamas problem is resolved? I mean, historically, everybody says, well, all the problems in the Middle East or the world or the universe would be solved if the Israeli-Palestinian problem went away. Do we have it backwards? Who would like to start? Dr. Asali? Press your button.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are many comments that can be said about this. Fundamentally, I think the two-state solution is more or less like democracy. It's the worst system except for all the others. If anybody gives us an alternative, we'd be very happy to listen to a workable solution. Just to say that it's not working is not enough. You have to have an end to this conflict. No conflict goes unended. So the two-state solution has not been given enough support, even at the present circumstances, to improve the situation well enough in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority, with knowing full well that Hamas has not supported the two-state solution and was not inclined to go along with it. The problem was...
Are you saying deal Hamas out of a two-state solution?
Yes, Hamas has been dealt out, and Hamas continues to be dealt out, and is not expected not to be dealt out. What is problem?
That's what you're advocating as well?
I am advocating that till they accept the quartet conditions. I think it makes sense, and I think the quartet conditions are simply an affirmation of the commitments that the PLO as the governing entity for the Palestinians has made, and that should be continued. What was lacking, unfortunately, was real progress, palpable progress by the Palestinian people on the ground, and this has many causes, but it could not have happened under occupation without the cooperation of the occupying powers, and it could not have happened without an improvement in the governing system in the PA.
Mr. McCoskey, 30 seconds.
I agree with Ziad completely with the issue of Hamas. They need to accept the conditions. I think if your premise is that the only thing that Hamas cares about is power, then I'm sure accommodations can be found. I just believe there are a lot of Islamist movements in the Middle East, and they have a very heartfelt religious ideology, and I don't think we do ourselves or them any favors if we shortchange. I don't think we do ourselves or them any favors if we shortchange their worldview. And they've been willing. I think we should listen to what they're saying.
Thank you. Ms. Flechter, 30 seconds.
I agree with David. I think it is very important for us to listen to exactly what they say. This is not just a political fight. This is an ideological fight, but we also have a practical battle ahead of us. You asked a very hard question. One, should we put Iran first? And the answer to that is no, of course not. We can't just walk on one path. We have to chew gum and walk. We need to work toward an Israeli-Palestinian solution, but we must prioritize the support for terrorism along with Iran's nuclear weapons program, or we will end up facing this in the rest of the region.
Dr. Dunn, 30 seconds, because my time is running.
Regarding Hamas, I think that our problem as the United States is we want Hamas to walk the road that the PLO walked 20 years ago, and Hamas sees very well that the PLO walked that road and it failed. And so that's the difficulty that we face now, is to give the Palestinians some hope in order to...
You're saying it failed because they have no state?
They failed for two reasons: because they have no state, and because also what Ms. Pletka pointed out, the disastrously bad governance and corruption. So they failed on both of those scores, and that's why we see the popularity of Hamas now.
Thank you. My time is run. Mr. Burton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say that my view on whether or not Mr. Sharon should have gone into or could have given Gaza back to the Palestinians, That was only my opinion. I certainly would not want to ever try to interfere or dictate to a foreign government on the policies that they have. But I did think that it was probably an error, and it did bother me a great deal. You indicated that there was a disproportionate amount of pressure put on by the Israeli military when they went in, and I thought they showed a great deal of restraint because the Hamas militants were using women and children in hospitals and mosques as shields against Israeli attacks, and the Israelis did stop so that they could minimize the civilian casualties. There were those who said that they should have pressed on further to completely destroy Hamas, but I think they showed a great deal of restraint, even though there were some differences of opinions there. Mr. McCoskey, the Washington Times reports this morning that Bibi Netanyahu is the likely winner. What's your opinion of that, and can you give me an answer on why that's the position they've taken? And does Saul, are you a friend of Saul Singer's?
I know Saul very well.
He used to be my first foreign policy guy, so would you tell him I said hi?
Will do.
Yeah, thanks.
I would just say on the, if I could say on the humanitarian part of your question, I think by firing from civilian areas, Hamas has shown its disregard for human life. And that put Israel in a very difficult position. I think one of the lessons Israel, though, has to take from this is to set up an urban core where you have designated safe zones that would be manned by soldiers, so it could not be exploited by terrorists. But that's the nature of warfare in the Middle East now with these non-state actors, is using urban areas, and that requires, I think, some reorganization in Israel. Okay. According to Mr. Netanyahu's policies, my belief is, from what he said and from the people around him who I've talked to in the last 24 hours, he's going to try to have a broad-based government with Ms. Livni of the Kadima party, who won the most.
So you anticipate that he will prevail?
If I was a Las Vegas odds maker, Congressman, I'd have to say that he will be the next prime minister.
Ms. Pletka, there are several high-profile delegations going to Syria, congressional delegations going to Syria in the next couple of weeks. What do you think about that? Do you think this is a wise thing to do?
An open-ended question. I never think that it's wrong for. I never think it's wrong for members of Congress to go on delegations to find out what foreign leaders are thinking. The only caution that I would give is not to be fooled by talk. We're really interested in what the Syrians are willing to do. Are they continuing to funnel arms to Hezbollah? Yes, they are. Are they continuing to interfere in Lebanese politics? Yes, they are. Are they continuing to allow killers into Iraq? Yes, they are. Have they got a burgeoning relationship with Al-Qaeda? Yes, they do.
Well, of course. What about Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has indicated that there's an opportunity for the Iranian government to demonstrate a willingness to unclench their fist and to begin serious and responsible discussion about a range of matters, and she goes on to indicate that there ought to be discussions. What do you think about discussions with Iran from the State Department, and do you think that congressional delegations ought to be involved in any way in discussing the situation in the Middle East with any Iranian officials?
I think that members of Congress should be as constrained as the State Department is in their discussions with Iranians. The United States government and foreign service officers and political appointees have been talking with the Iranians for years. Ambassador Khalilzad, our ambassador to Afghanistan and then to the UN, had regular meetings with Iranian counterparts. Ambassador Crocker in Baghdad has been meeting with them. I think we should not underestimate the imprimatur that the United States gives in having meetings with countries and the seal of approval that it conveys. If it is in fact a change in position on our part, it should be accompanied by an expected change in position on the part of the Iranians. We know what we're looking for. Let's see their bona fides.
My time's running out. Any of the others of you that would like to make a comment on that? Mr.
If I might just say something in response to the remark about the Israeli, what I call disproportionate. Two things. First off, a kill ratio of 100 to 1 or an injury ratio of 50 to 1 is a statistical evidence of something disproportionate, but there is a humanitarian aspect that is way too disproportionate. And also, the first reaction to the attack on Gaza was blamed by several Arab countries, including the head of the Palestinian Authority, President Abbas. It is afterwards that this relentless attack resulted in so much destruction, with TV pictures all over the place showing it, that they lost support.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. McMahon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this fascinating hearing. If you could speak to the most immediate needs of the population of Gaza, and is there a humanitarian crisis, or is the situation stable or just awful? Does the United States have a bigger role to play in helping the humanitarian side of what's going on the ground there? Do we have to then look at the reconstruction and stabilizing the situation as well? But what's going on in the daily lives of the people there, and how's the conditions?
First off, if I may, we need to take lessons from what happened in Lebanon in 2006, where a promise of aid was never delivered after the invasion, and Hezbollah took charge of that process, and it changed that help that it extended to incredible political benefit. I think this should not be lost, neither on this Congress or anywhere else. Secondly, the present humanitarian condition in Gaza is just beyond terrible. There are problems with water, electricity, roads, housing. There are over 50,000 people without shelter. There is no food. There's not enough food. There is not enough of anything. And the convoys that are supposed to carry aid are still restricted by access in every direction in Gaza. And there is no manufacturing. The quality of the life of the people at every level, the health, the education it probably is the worst anywhere in the world now. This needs to be addressed in and of itself as a separate issue from all the other reconstruction and other development that needs to be worked politically. This cannot be politicized. UNRWA, I heard some criticism about UNRWA this panel presentation. UNRWA is what we have now as a main provider of help to Gaza. Over 800,000 people depend on the food and other health and education facilities that are provided by UNRWA. There are other sources, of course, but this cannot be now a subject of serious political conversation. Let us get the humanitarian issue out of hand and controlled, and we propose that we have the special U.S. envoy deal with this issue promptly with the quartet, and we recommend the establishment of an international community that adds to the quartet Egypt, which is the indispensable partner and the one that can help in a meaningful way and whose role has been quite positive, plus is the Palestinian Authority, which has to take the political credit for this thing in order to carry this forward.
Mr. Makovsky?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that very last point. I think the key thing is that the Palestinian Authority needs to get the credit. You're all politicians. You understand the importance of the nature of credit and public support. And I think that this is crucial. There's going to be a donors conference in Cairo coming up, which I think will be key. I would just want to say on the issue of UNRWA, I'd be happy to, and I hope you don't see this as institutional self-promotion, James Lindsay, who was the legal counsel of UNRWA, wrote a study for us at the Washington Institute, a very serious, heavily footnoted study on UNRWA. We're not calling for the abolition of UNRWA at all. We just think that it should focus much more on its humanitarian mission, and with your permission, I'd like to circulate it to the members of the subcommittee. Thank you.
But Mr. McCuskey, can you speak to the human conditions in Gaza today?
No, I think that they're terrible conditions, and Hamas, they brought all this on them because they cared more about their ideology than helping their own people. But I don't think that means we should stand by. What I would hope is if the Palestinian Authority could be at the access points going into Gaza after they've been thrown out in 2007, there should be an international effort on humanitarian assistance and reconstruction, and I think we should all care about that.
Ms. Pletka, do you wish?
I wanted to say something quickly. I couldn't agree more with David. the humanitarian situation, just to your specific question, there should be no disagreement about the humanitarian situation on the ground, nor about the urgency of getting assistance to the Palestinians. On the other hand, I do think that there is an important role for the Congress, and this committee and your Senate counterparts can play a very strong role in ensuring that American assistance is not manipulated or abused, that it does not go to terrorist organizations directly or indirectly. There are rules right now that are under consideration for AID that would significantly weaken the vetting process that goes on to NGOs and their subcontractors. Money has gone to terrorist groups in the past, and you can stand in the way of that and ensure that assistance is used effectively, not just for our interests, but also for the Palestinians.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Inglis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose this question really involves something of a crystal ball for you to maybe assess what you think the approach would be of the new coalition that will be formed in Israel, and what their approach to the peace process would be, or how would they approach Gaza. And anybody want to take a stab at that? Shine up your crystal ball.
Look, I think the most likely outcome, whether Mr. Netanyahu or Ms. Livni is the next prime minister, is a broader-based government led by Likud and Kadima, those two parties. And you could say, well, you need unity if you're going to move forward. The issue is how much can be done. It seems to me that what Ziad said earlier and what the chairman said in his remarks about building a better alternative in the West Bank is part of the answer. It's not the whole answer. Improving economic institutions that Tony Blair and Dayton have been working on the security institutions that Three-Star General Keith Dayton's been working on, and training and equipping Palestinian security forces so Israel can pull back to the September 28th lines in the year 2000 at the start of the Intifada. There'll be, I'm sure, some discussion with the United States and Israel over a letter that was signed in 2004 between Secretary of State Rice and Mr. Weissglass, who was an aide of Mr. Sharon, about defining settlement, to make sure there's no expansion of settlements. This has been a contentious issue. I have a view. I don't claim it to be the view of my institute or of anyone else, but I believe the actual differences between the parties over land, despite what someone like, respectfully I say, former President Carter might think, the differences are actually very narrow. And I think there's actually more of a consensus in Israel on this. The Israelis are just afraid of being blown up, given the Qassam rockets coming out of Gaza. So if they didn't like the book in Gaza, they don't want to see the movie in the West Bank. So the question is, can you construct a situation where that you could demarcate the line and basically end once and for all the problem of settlements that has been a friction point since 1967, and say, here, we now know where the border is. This will be Palestine. This will be Israel. And move those settlers, but maybe the IDF, the Israeli army, will have to stand there until the Dayton mission over years will be able to demonstrate that it can pick up the slack and a vacuum will not be filled by terrorists. I think something to end this ambiguity that has been with us for so long. Sometimes ambiguity can be constructive, sometimes it's destructive. And I think a focus on the territorial dimension of this conflict, which everyone thinks is at the core, and I don't. I think it's been the problem of not rejecting that Israel's right to exist for the most part. But I think the territorial dimension, if you separated it from the security dimension, in my view, actually holds forth some promise. And it's possible. I'm not here making a grand prediction with a crystal ball, but I think that might be an area that the U.S. and Israel could actually engage upon, because the differences have narrowed between Israelis and Palestinians on the territory. The key is security, security, security.
If I may, I think there are two elections that count that have just happened. One of them was one in this country where there is a clear commitment of the new president, new administration to energetically get involved with the Middle East and pursue a two-state solution. What happened in Israel is still uncertain, of course, in many ways, but the leader of Israel would have to accommodate his policies to the policies of the United States in order to continue the grand strategic relation, and it is hard for me to to imagine that the leader of Israel would oppose the policy of the United States and stay in charge for very long. Having said that, I think there are many things that can be done regardless of what happens. One is improving the political conversation that is taking place with the Palestinian Authority and improving the security and economic situation in the West Bank. And part of this is to actually empower the Palestinian Authority by moving forward and forcefully on the Gaza reconstruction. There is a proposal by the Prime Minister of Palestine, Prime Minister Fayyad, to move $600 to $800 million through the banking system, a private enterprise solution to the present crisis in Gaza that bypasses the difficult and thorny issues. There is no question that the Israelis can be cooperative with that by allowing the money to go in. This has been another problem with Israel, not allowing actual money to go into Gaza. So there are many things that can be done on the margins as long as the policy approach remains solid towards a two-state solution.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, Ms. Berkeley. Just so the members know where they stand, for the questioning under the 5 minutes, we've switched to seniority order on the subcommittee, which is not necessarily the order people are sitting in right now, to add to the confusion. Ms. Berkeley, you are next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a lot of questions that I'd like to ask, but perhaps by way of speaking, and then I'll ask the questions. When it comes to rushing aid into Gaza and thinking that we're going to give credit to the Palestinian Authority and that the Palestinians in the Gaza are going to rise up and and throw Hamas away because they finally recognize who's helping them, I think is nonsense. If Hamas gave a whit about the Palestinian people, there would be peace and there would have been a two-state solution long ago. The reality is that there are many, many trucks getting through that provide aid and have equipment and food and medicine for the Palestinian people living in the Gaza. And we already know that Hamas has been commandeering these trucks and stealing the content instead of the content going where it needs to be. But this is nothing new and nothing surprising. So more trucks going in and more aid rushing in doesn't change the situation on the ground. Now, I agree with Ms. Pletka. Secretary Rice was sitting right where you were when when Hamas won the election, and she stated that American policy was not to give any aid to Hamas. So the Palestinian people would realize that Hamas was not where their destiny lay. But she said we were giving money to the NGOs. So, and I remember Mr. Ackerman asking this question, well, how do we track, how do we know that the money we're giving the NGOs is actually going to the Palestinian people? Her response took my breath away because she said, well, she says, we don't actually know because we don't have any people on the ground ourselves, but we know people who know people that tell us that the money we're giving the NGOs is actually going to the Palestinian people. I thought for a Secretary of State of the only superpower in the world to say that was absolutely astonishing to me. And I also agree with you that there is a reason that Hamas won this election, and it is because Fatah is corrupt and riddled with fraud and abuse of the Palestinian people. And I would submit to you that the Palestinian people's problem has nothing to do with money, because the quartet, particularly Europe and the United States, has given billions of dollars over the last several decades to the Palestinian people through their leaders. And I also would submit if the Palestinian Authority wants additional money, and they definitely need it because the Palestinian people are suffering, they might track down Arafat's widow, because I believe she's living very, very well on the hundreds of millions of dollars that we have donated to the Palestinian people. Now, she's living high on the hog. They're starving, and that's outrageous to me. Now, I cannot understand why the Palestinian people are held to such a low standard. If the Palestinians are ever going to have a state of their own that is governable, that they can take their children into a new direction and a new future for the Palestinian people, they have to get control of their own destiny. And it can't be constantly with their hat in hand asking for the rest of the world to keep bailing them out. I submit to you that the Palestinian people have to stand up for themselves, take control of their own destiny, and make a determination of who their leaders are that's going to move them into a new future. It's not Fatah. Abu Mazen is a very weak leader that does not even command the respect of his own people. That's not America's destiny, and we shouldn't be hooking up with him. And Hamas is a terrorist organization. Either way you go, the Palestinian people are the losers. And until the Palestinian people empower themselves, I don't see how we have a two-state solution, and I don't see how the United States partners with either Fatah and obviously not Hamas to help the Palestinian people. And I'm not sure that's a question, but that certainly is a statement precipitated by all of your comments. There is one other question that I wanted to Ms. Dunn. I understand some of the measures that you suggested, and I think they have been tried time and time again, but one in particular...
5 minutes are run.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Wexler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all agree that the United States policy vis-a-vis Hamas should be that we don't acknowledge, deal with, or in any official capacity engage with Hamas until Hamas meets the Quartet's principles. We agree with it. President Obama agrees with it. Secretary Clinton agrees with it. Seems to me then the question becomes how does the United States participate in a dynamic that either defeats Hamas or marginalizes it? And that to me is the question. Now, what I've heard from Arab leaders who have dealt with Hamas over the past several years and principally in the last several months, what I hear from them is that, very consistent to what has been said here, listen to what Hamas says. They are genuine in their expression of their goals. And the idea that there is a mechanism in which to co-opt Hamas from a terrorist organization into some type of constructive political entity is not realistic. So if they are correct and our policy remains the same, I go back to the original question, how then do we defeat or marginalize Hamas? Before I get there, though, just a few points if I could. Respectfully, Ms. Pletka, you are obviously an incredibly bright, informed, thoughtful person. And I agree with about 80% of your written testimony, but there are parts of it that I think undermine, in essence, the position that you take, or at least I think the position you take. You say American policy goals should be straightforward, an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict built on a stable edifice that may but should not necessarily include a state of Palestine. Well, if the United States is ambivalent in its support of a two-state solution, we condemn the moderates to fail in that arena, it would seem to me. Also, statements such as Abu Mazen and Salam Fayyad represent a new Palestine, supposedly, but rather they are the old Palestine that looks better only when compared to Hamas. Prime Minister Fayyad, I mean, no one's perfect, but the man has set up a transparent system of accountability that both the United States, Israel, and others believe in deeply. He is obviously handicapped in many different respects, but again, to dismiss the efforts, the ideology, and the perspective of Prime Minister Fayyad, I think is quite unhelpful and undermines the goal of what it is we're seeking to achieve. Dr. Asali, I agree with 90% of what you say. I respect you enormously. I would respectfully disagree as to the conclusion with respect to disproportionate force in the context of Israel's actions. To me, it's a false misnomer. no nation should act with proportionate force when it is attacked in the manner in which Israel was attacked by Hamas repeatedly. And Israel was totally justified in doing what it did, as catastrophic as the consequences undoubtedly were. But I do think you make one extremely important point. And I think those of us, and I'd like to think I'm one of them, who are deeply committed to the security, both professionally, emotionally, and personally, to the state, the security of the state of Israel, must say, and must say it in an unequivocal fashion, it is incumbent upon Israel to freeze settlement activity. That while in and of itself, that is not the only part of this equation. The Palestinians have enormous responsibilities, but the notion that Israel can continue to expand settlements, whether it be through natural growth or otherwise, without diminishing the capacity of a two-state solution, is both unrealistic and, I would respectfully suggest, hypocritical. And it is incumbent, in my view, upon the new administration, along with many other factors, to insist upon that part of previous agreements. So to the original question, how do we defeat Hamas? Please.
Hey, Congressman Wexler, you raise a very important point, and I would argue that we need a new paradigm in our relations with our Arab allies, with our friends in the Arab world, that we cannot let them off the hook. This is the core. Whatever we as Americans or what they, the Israelis, say about Hamas, it's one thing. In my view, the only people who could delegitimize Hamas are Arabs, are Muslims, and we need to make that point. I would like to just quote one thing Hosni Mubarak said, a rare statement. It was right after George Mitchell visited Cairo. So maybe there's a relationship there. He was speaking to the police academy, I believe, in Egypt. He says, the resistance must take into account victories and losses. It is responsible for the people who in turn should settle the score with the resistance over the gains it has achieved, but also the sacrifices, the pain, and the destruction it has caused. Ideally, the Arab states should say it's immoral to engage in terrorism. At minimum, they should say it's counterproductive. In my view, until the Arab leadership in these countries delegitimize what Hamas is doing, we're going to have very marginal return on everything else. They are the missing piece of this puzzle, and I would hope that Congress, with all its relationships with our Arab friends in Arab capitals around the world, that the leadership makes this point clear in Arabic on Arab satellite television together. I feel that there's really no other alternative. This has been an area which has not been pushed in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask the panel this question first. In the aftermath of the Israeli military operation in the Gaza, is Hamas politically stronger today or weaker?
Politically stronger in the West Bank and weaker in Gaza, if we are to believe the statistics and what we hear. And it is significant in that sense. There has been a war, a propaganda war, global propaganda war about this issue, and a fight about ideas and about images, etc., that has been very effective. And it did portray the destruction in Gaza as beyond, endurance in every way. And people were seeing that, not just in the West Bank, everywhere. And that has definitely accrued to the benefit of Hamas, not just in the West Bank, also in the Arab world. On the other hand, you can say that what we hear from Gaza, and this is supported by the recent surveys, the two surveys in fact, the people of Gaza live there. They have lived what happened, and they have an understanding of how it started, how it was triggered at least, and they still are suffering the consequences. So Hamas cannot very readily convince them by vote. And I go back to how we can defeat Hamas. Eventually, this has to be a democratic process. We have to believe in what we preach, and it is doable. Eventually, the Palestinians would have to vote. The Palestinians must vote at some point in time to give legitimacy to any kind of a government that comes. And this is how if you want to defeat Hamas, you have to convince them not that Hamas is offering a dead end, but that there is another end that actually works. That's why I cannot say enough about what Congressman Wexler said. You have to empower the people who are trying to offer the alternative, as you demand of them the accountancy and transparency that you need. You cannot just say all the Palestinians. If you say Hamas is terrible and Fatah is terrible, you condemning the Palestinians and the Israelis to a very dismal future.
Anyone else on the panel? Yes, Dr. Dunn.
I'd like to note that regarding the status of Hamas in the Arab world, unfortunately, it's in the opposite direction from what Mr. McCarthy suggested it should be. In other words, the status of Hamas has risen in the Arab world, and the recognition of Hamas as somehow the legitimate governing body, at least in Gaza, and perhaps the legitimate representative of the Palestinians. This is a very unfortunate development, but we saw, for example, Qatar invited the representative of Hamas to an Arab summit instead of the PLO. And this is a result of the hopelessness about the two-state solution, the sense that it isn't going anywhere and it isn't going to go anywhere, and also the weakness of the secular nationalist Palestinian leadership, the PLO and Fatah, which frankly has not been able to pull itself together in the last few years and to represent a strong alternative to Hamas.
Mr. McCoskey.
I'll just say very briefly, I mentioned in my remarks that only 35% of Gazans believe Hamas actually won the war. So I know people like to say that Hamas is 10 feet tall. I don't believe it, given those results. And Michelle is right about that in the Arab satellite television, which is a key form of communication, they did well with the publics. But I think it should be pointed out that President Mubarak, when he understood that national security interests were at stake, he held the line and didn't call for Hamas to take over the crossing points. And that, to me, is the key. The key is leadership at the top. The public is going to say what it's going to say, and we should care about that, of course, but we should care no less that the leadership, in my view, understand and act in concert when vital issues are at stake. Because Hamas there, and as Danny pointed out, with Iranian support, this is not in the interest of any Arab country. They understand very well who Hamas is aligned to. And I think we need to encourage them to be more clear in public. They whisper wonderful things in private to all of us. But what's important is what is said in Arabic in public to their own people. They could shape public opinion.
Mr. McCoskey, if I only have 30 seconds left. Could you expand a little bit? You predicted that if you were in Nevada, you'd bet on Netanyahu putting together some kind of coalition government. What's that going to look like, and what does that mean for the peace process moving forward, do you think?
I think a broader-based government with Livni, the Kadima party, and making her foreign minister, maybe giving one of her colleagues to be the defense minister. They'll cobble together a government. I think there'll be elements more on the more left side of Israel that will sit it out. But I think that clearly on economic issues, and this shows that there's been progress. I realize everyone can be very disdainful that no progress has been made. Everyone now thinks it's important to build economic institutions in the West Bank. Well, let's see that practically. What does that mean? We in the United States should put forward ideas, but economics is not enough. There has to be a movement on the political process, too. The economics won't sustain it. But I think under the able leadership of Mr. Fayyad, the Prime Minister, who's done fantastic work there, and with Blair and Dayton and all the others who are on the ground, we have a foundation to build on, and that any new Israeli government is going to be receptive to it. But again, it's not sufficient. I accept the point on the settlements, and the broader process, but there's something to build on.
Thank you. The chair believes Mr. Ellison will be back in. In the meantime, we will entertain a second round of questions for 2 minutes from each of the members, if that's okay with the panel. I'll turn first to my ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question. And Syria is the quote-unquote headquarters for Hamas. Is there any hope or any indication that discussions between members of Congress or the administration with the leadership in Syria, that we could bring about a change in their attitude and toward Israel and toward stability in the Middle East? And would that be a worthwhile endeavor as far as stopping them from being a conduit for weapons getting into Hezbollah and Hamas coming in from Iran? In other words, is there any chance that we could have some reasonables out of Syria if we had discussions with them on a multi-level basis?
to say, if I may, very briefly, and Danny Pletka and I may disagree on this one, but I think it's at least worth a conversation of the new administration with the authorities in Syria about peace. They have to understand what this involves. It's a realignment of their regional foreign policy. Are they going to sever their military alliance with Iran? Are they going to stop missile flow to Hezbollah? That would be a huge windfall if they're willing to do basically what Egypt did in the 1970s and expel the Hamas and Islamic Jihad offices. I don't think we know the answer to that. And I'm not here to say that I know the answer, but my view is it doesn't hurt to have a conversation with the Syrian authorities about that.
David's right. We do disagree. I think that the problem is not in talking. All of us have enjoyed the election and talking about talking to our enemies, and we're done with that now. But let's not fool ourselves. The prospect that Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, is going to sever his relationship with Iran, end his support for Palestinian so-called rejectionist groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, cut off the conduit of weaponry and everything else to Hezbollah, and disentangle his own government from interference in Lebanon, and let's not forget that is a priority for the United States, means essentially that he would recast the entire nature of the Ba'athist Alawite regime in Damascus. And certainly, I believe it is his estimation that it would be his downfall. So what we're really saying is, come and lie to us a little bit so we can move forward with you and that we can put in place the elements of this great, great game in which all the dominoes fall into place, and we talk to Iran, we isolate them, we isolate the Palestinians, we cut off Syria. I'm sorry, forgive me, I've been doing this a little bit too long. It's not credible. We can go in with an open mind, but for goodness sakes, let's not engage in fantasy.
Mr. Makovsky, in discussing reconstruction, you noted the enormous potential of the wealthy Gulf states, and you urged the U.S. to seek their involvement in the process. What price do you think we would have to pay them in order to get their wholehearted and open-handed support? And what do they need to make contributions worthwhile politically?
But I'm not sure I know the answer. But I mean, they who are the biggest advocates of, in theory at least, of Palestinian nationalism should at least be supportive of their brethren. That has not often been the case. The things they could do are not just in Gaza, but if they could just do large-scale housing construction projects in the West Bank, I think they'd help the Palestinian Authority enormously. And my view is we just shouldn't let them off the hook. They're very happy to hold our coats and see us pressure the parties. But I think we should just be more insistent than we've been in the past of their participation. And that means economic participation, that means their political suasion, and their use of the public, bully public, to make its views clear on which parties are bringing us closer to a two-state solution and which ones are bringing us farther away. And I think because of maybe other priorities we've had and maybe the price of oil and all sorts of issues, we have not been energetic in dealing with the Gulf states, and I would hope that would change with the Obama administration.
The interesting statistics that have been cited as to who believes Hamas won the war, with that indication saying that that was a more popular notion in the West Bank than in Gaza. I guess it's because the people in Gaza have to live with the reality, and the people in the West Bank can live with the romance. In a year from now, what does that poll show?
Well, we hope, and we hope this committee and this administration in general would contribute to answering that question in the right direction. I think a commitment to improving the situation in the West Bank, and here I cannot but emphasize how positive the role of General Dayton and his security forces build-up has been important in order to bolster the safety and security of the Palestinian people, which would in turn make it possible to make economic improvements, and all this within the context of a political horizon would be the way to point for the future elections if it is held, let's just say, 1 year from now. The Palestinian people cannot but see some kind of an improvement on the ground if they are going to be voting the way you want them to vote. We hope that they would vote. Settlement freeze, unquestionably, because it undercuts the credibility of the two-state solution. This has to be, and this is a political as well as a practical step that can be taken. Secondly, withdrawal from cities, and David has already alluded to the 28th of September, very positive, and access and mobility, improvement of these things. This is not just talk. This is the way people live. I understand pork in this country. I think we all understand pork in this country. Well, pork is everywhere. If you do not give pork to the people of Palestine, then how can they possibly respond to the kind of politicians? And add to that the accusation
This is a Muslim explaining to a Jew why pork is necessary.
It works, doesn't it?
I think it's the grease.
I just add very briefly to Ziad's answer of two specific programs that I think, and if Congress would undertake to help out on the West Bank. The United States Customs Service in different countries has a container initiative program to seal containers for export. In my view, if this was done in the West Bank, and working with the Israeli authorities as well, that the Israelis would have to worry that there are bombs in there, et cetera, it could fast-track Palestinian exports, and exports has been a huge problem. The second element is biometrics at crossing points that could ensure that movement and access is upgraded. So my whole premise is, how do you improve Palestinian institutions and better life, and not at the expense of Israeli security? I don't believe it has to be a zero-sum game. And Mr. Chairman, and mentioning your remarks, I think it is interesting there were virtually no demonstrations in the West Bank during the Gaza initiative. So I think that's an interesting sideline.
Were there no demonstrations, or were they tamped down?
There were demonstrations, but they were ruly and orderly.
Anybody else want to answer the underlying question?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to add a point regarding, I think we need to be realistic about the need for a stronger and more unified leadership, nationalist leadership on the Palestinian side. All of these things that we are speaking of, improving economic conditions, freezing settlement movement and so forth, all of this can help, but none of it will be enough if the Palestinians are not able to, if Fatah is not able to pull itself together in some way, because that was one of the reasons why they lost the 2006 elections, in addition to the greater credibility that Hamas had in some ways. Also, Fatah was extremely disorganized, and we've seen that continue despite good leadership of the Palestinian Authority on the ground by Prime Minister Fayyad and President Abbas. We still have seen a failure of political organization and unity. The Fatah has been trying to organize a general conference to renovate its leadership and so forth, and has failed to do so. So this is a continuing problem that we have to be aware of and be realistic about.
Thank you. Mr. Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCoskey, could you identify for us which organizations, which international aid organizations have the experience, the infrastructure, the wherewithal to deliver aid in Gaza?
Look, I don't feel that I'm qualified. I mean, a lot of them, I think there was just $20 million that the United States gave through the International Red Cross and some of the other NGOs. I don't think people are questioning the ability of these organizations so identified by the United States. So
I only ask you because the issue of UNRWA has come up. And I just want to know, do you believe they're one of the groups that are effective at delivering aid in Gaza?
Well, as I said before, and I'll say it again, I feel that UNRWA has an important humanitarian mission. And my hope would be it would focus on its humanitarian mission. I think there's some other parts that it has evolved into that were not in its original mission when UNRWA was formed. And I think it's strayed in those areas. And I think the goal is not to abolish it, but to make it more effective. And I think that should be the hope.
Thank you. I'm curious to know your views on the Israeli election. Obviously, things are so unsettled; it's pretty tough to know what's exactly going to happen. But in my reading and research, I have run across documents which seem to suggest that Mr. Netanyahu does not necessarily support the two-state solution. Could you give me a better reading as to whether some of those documents that I read are accurate, whether they're not accurate? And if he doesn't support the two-state solution, what does that mean in terms of the U.S. policy?
Look, I think here it's going to be what sort of government is configured. If there's a broad-based government, I think there is hope. Ms. Libni is a very passionate advocate for a two-state solution. And to be fair to Mr. Netanyahu, who said, well, he wouldn't talk to Yasser Arafat. I remember when he was in the opposition in '96. Well, when he won, he met with Arafat within 100 days of taking office. And he's the one also, when there was the issue of Hebron. Hebron is one of the most religiously charged cities. And he was the one who reached an agreement there. So I don't think we should disqualify people, but I do think the constellation of power is important. And there's no doubt I would have more confidence if he, in terms of his own rule, as part of a broader-based government. I think if he leads a narrow government, frankly, I am very concerned. I do not think this will be a walk in the park in terms of U.S.-Israel relations in the future. But I don't think he wants to go that way, and he said publicly it would be wrong for him to go that way, and this is one of his biggest regrets when he was in power in the 1990s.
So, Mr. Asali, do you have any views on the same question I just put to Mr. Murkowski? So let me just tighten it up. If Mr. Netanyahu is the prime minister, and given some of the things he's reported to have said, and I can't say he said them to me, so I don't know if he said them or not, I just know what I read. How does the position that he hasn't affirmed the two-state solution square with the U.S. policy embracing a two-state solution?
Well, I think I discussed this earlier about having two elections that matter. One of them was the elections in the United States, where President Obama is clearly committed to a two-state solution, and this administration is. And there is no doubt in my mind that the agenda of the United States is should I say, carries more weight than the local agenda anywhere when it comes to real discussions about international interests. I imagine that Mr. Netanyahu would have to adjust his thinking or his campaign rhetoric or his previous position to come to some terms with the President of the United States if he's going to have any relations that are meaningful.
And Ms. Dunn, could you offer some views on some of the comments that Mr. Netanyahu has said reported in the press? Again, I haven't talked to him, so I don't know if he said this, but he's reported to have said he wasn't in favor of negotiating land for peace with Syria on the Golan. Are you familiar with those comments?
Actually, I'm
rather
probably
talk about
less
Egypt?
an expert on Netanyahu's statements.
Yeah.
And,
Well, let's go back to Mr. McCoskey then.
Look, here is welcome to the Middle East.
Right.
Because Mr. Netanyahu said that and went up to the Golan Heights when he said it. But the same Mr. Netanyahu, through a cosmetics executive by the name of Ronald Lauder in 1998, actually cut a backdoor deal. It was waiting a signature. And it was a fellow named Ariel Sharon, who was then his foreign minister, who squashed it. I think there's speculation in Washington and a lot of capitals that Mr. Netanyahu, if he's going to surprise us, will surprise us on the Syria track, because there the issues are much more clear-cut, given what was said before about Iran and Hezbollah, the regional benefits. The biggest cheerleaders in Israel for talks with Syria are the Israeli military. And given his track record in '98 and the fact that Mr. Sharon tragically is not around to stop it, I don't think we could rule out that what Mr. Netanyahu said on the campaign trail and what he says and what he does in office may be two separate things.
Am I all set? Am I all done, Mr. Chairman? Okay. Now, we have now a three-state situation, not a two-state. What position should the U.S. take regarding Palestinian unity talks? I mean, one of the interesting things that's going on here is that if the United States or if Israel's, if Mr. Mahmoud Abbas said, I will sign any document you put in front of me, he still couldn't speak for all the Palestinian people. What does that mean going forward? Ms. Dunn, do you care to offer a view on that?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you've raised an extremely important point, Congressman, that this lack of Palestinian unity, lack of a unified leadership is a serious problem moving forward. It seems to me, I'm not an advocate of direct U.S. engagement with Hamas, which we consider to be a terrorist organization, but I do think that the United States has become gradually more supportive of efforts by Egypt, for example, to get Fatah and Hamas talking to each other and to try to work out some sort of unified arrangement. There is the possibility of some kind of a technocratic type of Palestinian government, or a government that would not bring senior leaders of Hamas into major positions. There's probably some kind of arrangement like this needs to be worked out so that there can be a restoration of some semblance of connection or unity between the West Bank and Gaza once again, and so that the Palestinians eventually can move toward elections, and hopefully can move toward elections under a situation where there's a much more hopeful prospect for realization of the two-state solution and so forth. But all of this is going to take some time. And the United States, I also agree with what Ms. Pletka said in terms of the United States not really being able or being very good at getting in and trying to re-engineer Palestinian politics directly.
Mr. Asali, you want to talk on this?
Yes, thank you. This and many other issues have really been dealt with in our long document, and I recommend for people who have time to read it. I think the idea that a unity government that would repeat Mecca agreement that would be rejected by the international community is a non-starter. We do not want to have a Palestinian government again in a position where it is in its entirety rejected by the international community. What can be done, and what is being considered as far as I know, is what is called a national accord government, whereby you have individuals who are supported by Fatah or Hamas or whatever, who would serve on that government without direct participation of either Fatah or Hamas as partisans, which would have two assignments. One is work on the relief and reconstruction business. Two is prepare for elections. I think this is not an entirely bad idea. I think it's something that most people can live with, and I think this is something that the Egyptians are working very hard to put together. We will see how this gels in the next few days in Cairo, and I think that the United States has to commit itself to the idea that a two-state solution is appropriate, and elections to validate whatever agreement that eventually are subjected to the Palestinian people through negotiations is the way to go. If that is acceptable, then we can make progress, I think.
What progress can we make in terms of opening up the crossings? As I understand from things I've read from UNRWA, there's about 120 trucks going through the Kearney crossing now, and they need about 700 a day. What can be done to get the aid flowing to the degree that it needs to be? Mr. Asali, you want to address?
Yes. First off, I just want to say that these are the statistics, that accurate statistics that all of us have, and I think there is, with all due respect, there is a problem still with delivering, these trucks, and it is all tied into the security issues, or the explanation that it is a security issue. We said that there are two separate issues that have to be dealt with immediately. One is the humanitarian relief. You cannot have people not have enough to eat or drink or have their daily needs, day-to-day life, hospital, etc. You cannot have that and accept it and accept any kind of a political explanation for that. Those kinds of things have to be dealt with these kinds of organizations that we talked about, UNRWA, CHF, etc., etc. All of them have to have enough, and they have the statistics. They know how many trucks are needed, and the materials that Israel would let go through. All these things have to be done and done quickly. The other is reconstruction.
No, last one, Mr. McCuskey. If Israel could open up those Kearney crossings, and if they had the scanning material that they needed to make sure there was no contraband coming in, wouldn't that make the security issue on the border easier? Because then you could assume that, you know, any non-humanitarian goods service type stuff, anybody in those tunnels is probably up to no good.
I think you raise a very good point. And once you make the distinction between that'd be clear that anything that goes through the tunnels is patently illegal. I think that's a very good idea. I just think the Palestinian Authority should be the one manning those crossing points to get the credit. But I certainly believe humanitarian assistance, which Israel says it is doing, that whatever can be done is intensified.
Unless anybody has an immediate solution to the problem in the Middle East and the funding, this committee will be adjourned.
Did a good job.
Thank the witnesses.
Enjoyed our first meeting together.